welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how you can create your very own scrap yarn scarf using your Sentro 48 knitting machine. In saying that, if you don't have a Sentro knitting machine, that is totally fine. This will work on any knitting machine, so never fear. These scarves are great because they are a great stash busting project. So if you do have some old scrap yarn laying around that you want to get rid of, this is a great project for that. These are great if you are doing scarves for charity or if you are preparing for a market this winter. So if that is something you are interested in, just keep on watching. Okay, so to get started, you are of course going to need a knitting machine. I'm using my Sentro 48 peg knitting machine today, but you can use any knitting machine that you like. I am also, of course, using scrap yarn. I've got a bag of scraps here that I just want to get rid of, so that's what I'm going to be using today, but you don't have to use scraps for this scarf. That's just what I'm using. If you wanted to do this in one solid color or in a more planned out color scheme, then you can of course do that as well. I'm just using up some scraps because, to be honest, they've been in storage for a really long time and I just want to get rid of them. So anyway, I am going to be using waste yarn for this project. If you're not familiar with waste yarn, I do have a video explaining everything you need to know on my channel. So please feel free to go and watch that first before we get started. But I'm just going to be casting on with some waste yarn. I'm using black purely because I don't plan on using black in my scarf at all. So this will be a contrasting color to whatever color I decide to use for my scarf. So we're just going to pop the end into the middle like that. And we are going to cast on with our waste yarn first of all. Again, if you're not familiar with the cast on method, I do have another video on my channel, so please feel free to go and watch that before we get started. Okay, so I have finished casting on with my waste yarn. I am now going to crank out about 10 to 15 rounds of waste yarn just to be safe, and I will meet you back here once I'm done. Okay, so I have cranked out 13 rounds of waste yarn. I am going to cut this yarn because I'm going to use the remainder of this at the end of my scarf because we will be using waste yarn at the end as well. And now we can get started cranking out our scarf. So I actually have a ball of scrap yarn that I've started making up here. So I'm going to use this first, but then I've got a whole bag here that needs to be used as well. So I'm not actually doing any color order in particular. I'm just going to be choosing colors at random. You can, of course, do certain color orders or put colors together that you think will go together better. I'm doing this completely random. I should also mention that the scrap yarn I'm using is pretty much all going to be 8-ply, so a DK weight yarn, which is what I find works best in the knitting machine. You can also use a 10-ply or an Aran/worsted weight yarn in these machines, but they can be a little bit temperamental with the thicker yarns. So I like to try and stick with the DK/8-ply yarns, but it is a little bit of trial and error because some 10-plies will work perfectly fine, whereas others are a little bit more tricky. So see how you go, but I'm going to try and stick with 8-plies as much as I can, just depending on what is in my scrap bag. So I'm now going in with the scrap yarn, or if you're using a solid color or if you're using specific colored yarns, this is going to be the first color in your scarf. So I am just taking my scrap yarn and we're going to go in under that first peg and crank slightly until that is just to the right of our yarn guide here. And then we're going to pop that yarn into our yarn guide and then into our tension gauge. And then we can just start cranking as normal. I've also reset my round counter, so at least then that way I can tell you guys exactly how many rounds I've done for the entire scarf. I don't have any certain amount of number in mind. I'm just going to keep cranking until I think that it is long enough, and we'll see how we go, but I will definitely let you guys know how many rounds I've ended up with at the end. So because our waste yarn doesn't count, I've just reset it back to 0, so just keep that in mind when I tell you the round count. It won't include the waste yarn rounds. Anyway, let's get cranking. Okay, quick update. This is what it's looking like so far. I think the colors are looking pretty cool. I'm very interested to see how this turns out. Again, I'm just doing colors at complete random. I've got no color order in mind at all. I just wanted to show you guys how I join in my yarn to make sure it's not going to come undone. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can either do what I've done and go ahead and join all your scraps together before we begin. And in that case, it'll all be joined and you won't really have to worry about anything. The only issue with that is because you will have knotted your yarn together, it won't flow nicely through your yarn guide and your tension gauge. So you just have to keep an eye on that when the color changes come up, just so you can guide it through to make sure it doesn't get caught or break your machine, because if it can't flow freely through the tension gauge, then you don't want that to snap off. The other option is to do what I've done at the beginning with joining in my first color after we completed the waste yarn. And as you guys saw, I just threaded that in under and cranked as normal. But then what you will need to do is find your ends and then tie them together, which I'm not going to do because obviously the black yarn is my waste yarn, so that's going to be removed anyway, so I don't want it to be joined to my scarf color. But just as an example, if that was how you were joining in your different colored yarns, then you would then go in and just knot those two colors together to make sure that it's not going to come undone. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments down below. I'll try my very best to assist. But I just thought I would give you guys an update. I've done 44 rounds so far. I think it's looking pretty cool, but I'm going to keep cranking and I'll give you another update once I've done a fair few more rounds. All right, so here I am at the end of round 206. I think I will stop here. The length is looking pretty good. This is what the scarf's looking like so far. I'm pretty happy with how it's turning out. So I'm gonna go ahead now and join in my waste yarn to finish off. I do still have a little bit of length here, so I am just gonna crank until that end is a little bit shorter. Just like that. I'm then going to remove that from my yarn guide and just pop it in the middle there. Then I'm going to take that black waste yarn once again and thread it into my machine, just like we did at the very beginning. So cranking until that peg is just to the right of our yarn guide, and then placing our waste yarn into that yarn guide and into our tension gauge. So now again, I am just going to crank out 10 to 15 rounds of waste yarn. I just want to mention once again that I did do 206 rounds for the scarf. That does not include the waste yarn rounds. So 206 rounds is the length of the scarf, not including the waste yarn, just for your own information if you are wanting to make your scarf the same length as mine. You could of course stop cranking earlier or crank for longer if you wanted a longer scarf, but that's just what I did, 206 rounds. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead now and crank out 10 to 15 rounds of waste yarn and I will meet you back here to finish off. Okay, so I have just cranked out about 12 rounds of the black waste yarn. What I'm going to do now is remove that waste yarn from my machine. I'm not going to cut it because the waste yarn is going to be removed anyway, so I'm going to try and keep this for next time. So no need to cut your waste yarn if you don't want to. Now what we're going to do is remove our scarf from our machine. So all we're going to do that is just hold on to our waste yarn and crank until it pops off. Just like that. We can now remove our machine. And this is what our scarf is looking like now that it's finished. Just be careful not to pull on that waist yarn because we don't want to unravel anything just yet because we haven't fastened off our work, so just be careful of that. But you can now go in and kind of just stretch out your work. So it's all nice and condensed. And this is our scarf, guys. Pretty cute, if I do say so myself. So now what you're going to want to do is take a crochet hook or a darning needle. This can work both ways. I much prefer the crochet hook method, but if you don't know how to crochet, then please, by all means, feel free to use a darning needle. And now it's time for us to fasten off our work and remove our waste yarn. So first up, you want to lay your scarf flat and just make sure that it is all straight and not twisted in any way. So once you've made sure it's all nice and flat, we are ready to fasten off. And I'm just going to take some of this reddish colored yarn, which is the same color as I finished on here. You don't have to do the same color. I'm just doing that because why not? I've got some here, so I may as well. So then it's a bit more of a clean seam, but you don't have to use the same color. Again, this is a scrap scarf, so it really doesn't matter. Now what we want to do is flip our work inside out, sort of like this, so you can clearly see all the stitches. So you'll see that this is why we use a contrasting waste yarn, so we can clearly see all our stitches here because they're the stitches we want to fasten off so our work doesn't unravel. So taking your crochet hook and your yarn or your darning needle and yarn, whichever you prefer, we're going to line up all our stitches so we can join them together. So you want to find the first two stitches here that are opposite each other and pop either your darning needle or your crochet hook in under those stitches. I've just started with a slip knot on my crochet hook, so if you're using a crochet hook, please feel free to do the same. And then I'm just going to go in with a slip stitch and join those two stitches together, just like that. And then we are moving on to the next two stitches and repeating that exact same process. So you'll see here that I can see my next two stitches are right there. So just going in with my crochet hook in that first stitch and then the one directly opposite it. And slip stitching to join those together. Again, we're doing the exact same thing in the next two stitches, so lining those two stitches up opposite each other, going in that first stitch, and then finding that stitch that's directly opposite, and fastening off with a slip stitch. Again, I'll show you guys one more time, finding that next stitch, finding that stitch that's directly opposite, and slip stitching to join. And we're just going to repeat that process all the way along. If you've done it correctly, you shouldn't have any stitches left at the end. Everything should line up nice and symmetrically because this is a 48 peg machine, so even amount of stitches, which means every stitch should have a partner. So go ahead, do that. I will meet you back here at the end once I have fastened off all these stitches all the way across. Sorry guys, I did also just want to mention that you will need to go in and fasten off the end that you popped into the middle of your machine before we joined in our waste yarn. So you could do this one of two ways. So you could have left a big long tail and used that tail to join your stitches together. That's probably what I should have done in hindsight, but I didn't. So if you're like me and that is not what you did, you are going to want to fasten off this end. How you do that doesn't really matter. I'm just going to go in with my crochet hook and kind of tie a knot back on itself just so I know that that's not going to come undone. And then we can continue joining our stitches together. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Don't hate me. I'm going to go ahead now, finish off these, and I will meet you back here at the end. Okay, here I am at the end of this seam here. I have just joined in my last 2 stitches, everything lined up perfectly, which is great. That's what we want. So we can now go and fasten off this end. So I'm just going to cut my yarn and just pull that through. And again, I'm just going to knot it back on itself just to make sure that it is nice and secure. And now we can remove our black waste yarn. So we want to find the end of that waste yarn, and it should just unpull nice and easily. So I'm just going to wind it back into this ball so I can use it again next time. But as you can see, it should just pull away really nice and easily, just like that. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have used black. It's really not the best color. My apologies, guys. Hopefully you can see everything okay. I will know for next time not to use black. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea. But anyway, hopefully you guys get the idea. All right, as you can see, all my waste yarn has been removed. All we're left with now is these 2 ends that we will just need to go in and sew in. The great thing about the knitting machine when you are using the tube method is you can just pull your ends to the inside of both layers and you don't actually have to sew them in. So that's what I like to do, just hide them in the middle of your tube. You can of course go in with a needle if you wanted to and sew them in. Totally up to you, but I'm lazy and, you know, it's all about working smarter, not harder. So that's what I'm doing. Before you do this, of course, just make sure that your ends are nice and secured and you have fastened them off correctly. Okay, now that you've hidden your ends, that is that end nice and secure. We know it's not going to come undone because we have secured all those stitches. And now we just need to do that exact same process on the opposite end of our scarf. I'm not going to show you that on camera. I will go ahead and do that off camera and I will meet you back here once it's done, and then we're going to add some fringing to the end of our scarf. Okay, so once you've fastened off both ends of your scarf, you then want to take something that is about the length of the fringe that you want to achieve. I want my fringe to be approximately that long. This ruler is a 6-inch ruler, so I want my fringe to be about 6 inches long. So I'm going to use this ruler. You could use a bit of cardboard, a book, literally anything. It really doesn't matter as long as it is about the length that you want your fringe to be. If it's too long, that doesn't really matter either. You can always trim it once we're done if you need to. Then you're going to take some more scrap yarn, just whatever you've got left over, and we're going to wrap as many different colors around whatever you're using, however many times you like. It will depend on how full you want your fringe to be, but remember, we can always just do more later on if we don't have enough. So I'm just going to start wrapping this purple yarn around my ruler, and this is what we're going to use to create our fringe. Now remember, we're going to be doing more than one color, so you don't need to do a whole heap of one color. Once you've done it, you know, what you think is enough times, we're going to cut that off, and then we're going to remove this from our ruler. Pop your finger through the center there so it stays nice and tidy. And then what you want to do is take your scissors and cut through the bottom, so where your end is, that same end there. You want to take your scissors and just cut through all those loops. So then you should be left with, whoops, I've missed one. So now you should just be left with a whole bunch of strands of yarn, and that is what we're going to use to create our fringe. So I'm just going to sit those there, and I'm going to repeat that exact same process with a few different colors because I want to have a multicolored fringe. But if you just wanted one color, then you could just use one color. It is totally up to you. Okay, once you have cut a decent amount of lengths of yarn, we can now start our fringing process. So it is very, very easy. I like to use a crochet hook to do this. You could also use a darning needle, but I definitely want to say that a crochet hook is going to be much, much easier. So if you do have a crochet hook lying around, go and get it. You will thank me later. Okay, so what we want to do is choose which end you want to start with first. And then we're going to take just a few strands. I'm going to do 3 strands per stitch, I suppose. Once you've chosen your strands, you're going to fold them in half, just like this, trying to get the ends as even as possible. If they're not perfect, don't stress too much. We can go in and trim them later. The main thing is you want to just create a little loop at the top here, and then you're going to go into the end of your scarf, just into those stitches there. And using your crochet hook, you're going to pull that loop through the end of your scarf. We can then remove our hook, and I just use my fingers for this part, inserting your fingers through that loop there, grabbing that end and pulling it back through itself. And that is literally all there is to it. How easy was that? I'll show you guys again. So again, I'm going to use 3 strands of yarn. I'm just choosing colors at total random, so don't think about it too much. Getting those ends nice and even, folding it over and creating that loop at the top, taking our crochet hook, finding that next stitch in the end of our scarf, or just, you know, the next space, pulling that loop through, and then taking our fingers and pulling those ends through again. Pull it nice and tight so you know it's not going to come undone. And that is how you do it, guys. We're just going to repeat that process all the way across, all the way along the end of our scarf for both ends, and then we're done. So super duper easy. I will go ahead and complete that now, and I will meet you back here and we'll see what the finished product looks like. Okay, once you have finished your fringe, you should be left with something that looks a little bit like this. Now, if you've got yarn in there, so say for instance for me this red color, I actually pulled from another project, so it is a little bit wavy. You could go ahead and steam your fringe just lightly, especially if you're using acrylic yarn. You don't want to put too much heat into it because it will melt, but you could lightly steam your fringe just to make it all nice and straight and flat. But if not, over time those creases will just come out themselves anyway, so don't stress too much about it. But you could then also take your scissors and trim your edge if you wanted to. I kind of like the little bit of unevenness. It gives it a little bit of a more rustic look. So I'm going to leave mine, but if you had huge, you know, length differences in your fringe and you wanted to tidy it up, you could by all means take your scissors and give it a quick haircut. But that brings us to the end of today's tutorial, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you did enjoy it. If you did, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up. And as always, if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on your notifications so you will be notified of all my future videos. If you haven't already, please come and join me in the Talk Yarny to Me Facebook group. I would love to see you there. The link is in the description down below. But until next time, guys, take care, stay safe, and I will see you next time. Bye.